Your video, I will once again only go over the parts that I feel like need reinforcing. But for the other details, you will need to go over them on your own and make sure you cover them thoroughly. Okay, and reach out to me if you have questions. Okay, so this part I would like for you to go over on your own. Instead, I'm going to skip to talking about this diagram. This diagram shows you the organization of your nervous system. Our nervous system can be divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So everything outside the brain and the spinal cord is considered peripheral nervous system. Okay. And we'll talk about what nerves and ganglia are later. But in summary, nerves are neuronal cell processes in the periphery, so in the peripheral nervous system, whereas ganglia are the cell bodies of those neurons. Okay. Now, okay. Within peripheral nervous system, we can further divide it into sensory and the motor divisions. The sensory division, also known as afferent division, is the part of peripheral nervous system that's responsible for relaying information from the external environment into toward the nervous system, toward the central nervous system. Okay, so as an example, when you touch the stove, okay, and you feel, and your brain recognizes that it's hot, that's a function of the sensory division. Okay, that heat is triggering that sensory nerve, and that sensory nerve sends that signal into your brain, and your brain processes that as hot. Now, the fact that you are withdrawing your finger from the stove, that's a function or a result of the motor division. Okay, so this sensory division can then relay the information to trigger the motor division to act. But this motor division is going to send a signal away from the central nervous system. Okay, and it could either send a signal onto a skeletal muscle, in which case it's considered part of the somatic nervous system, or it can send the signal to cardiac muscle or smooth muscle or gland. So these will be functions of the autonomic nervous system. Okay. Somatic nervous system is under voluntary control. So these are the neurons, the network of neurons that control voluntary action. Okay, so they stimulate skeletal muscle. Whereas in the autonomic nervous system, this is synonymous with visceral motor system. In this nervous system, these network of neurons control the actions of smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands, like sweat glands, okay, but also like salivary glands and other glands. And it tells these different tissues and organs to act. Okay, and notice that these are involuntary actions, so these functions cannot be controlled consciously. Okay. The autonomic nervous system, we have a separate lecture dedicated to that topic. Okay, but so later in a few lectures we'll talk about its two sub-branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. This table goes over the details on the different sensory modalities and motor modalities in the peripheral nervous system. Okay. Be sure you understand, if I ask you what type of, sensory modality is used to detect pain in your stomach, you would say visceral sensory, okay, as opposed to somatic sensory or somatic motor or visceral motor. Okay, and so the easier way to remember this is that, okay, the somatic motor has to do with innervation of skeletal muscles. Okay. The somatic sensory has to do with detecting where those muscle fibers are, those skeletal muscle fibers are. Okay. Also, things that are considered more external, those things that are the sensory receptors present on the skin, vibration receptors present on the skin. Okay. Also, the receptors that are responsible for detection of temperature. Okay. And where your body parts are relative to one another. So that's the concept of proprioception. Proprioception is the senses that are used to detect and monitor where one body part is relative to another. And this allows you to close your eyes and well, not the action of closing your eyes, but once you close your eyes, the fact that you're able to use your fingertip to touch your nose, okay, without looking at where the finger is. That's a function of proprioception. In other words, this proprioception allows your brain to know where that finger is relative to the nose, so that the finger is able to reach the nose. So someone who has impaired proprioception may have difficulty accomplishing that task. Okay, moving on to nervous tissue. This stuff you can go over on your own. Okay, so this is a general schematic of neuron anatomy. Every neuron has a cell body. Okay, and most neurons have dendrites. Dendrites are cell processes that relay information toward the cell body. So in other words, this signals, electrical signals, are being conducted from the dendrites into the cell body. And these signals are summed up within the cell body. They're added together. If the sum of those signals exceeds a certain threshold, okay, it's going to trigger the axon hillock. Okay, so this initial segment of the axon to fire an action potential. Okay, another term for action potential is impulse. Okay, so this axon hillock, once it's triggered to fire an impulse, that impulse will then be relayed down the axon to the end. This portion is called the axon terminal. At the axon terminal, okay, this will then form a junction onto the next neuron, and we'll see on the next page what that is called. So that's like a synapse. A synapse is just a junction between two neurons. Okay, and I even included a video here for you to watch. This is a very good video. You should definitely go over that. Okay, what I want to point out specifically in this video is the unidirectionality of neurons. Okay, it's very important you understand that in neurons, that signal, electric signal, only goes in one direction. Okay, so the dendrites are always receiving the information, receiving that electrical information, and then it's traveling toward the cell body. The cell body sums up the signal, and then if it's past the threshold, tells the axon hillock to fire an action potential or fire an impulse. That impulse then is transmitted down the axon. Okay, and you will never see the incoming electrical signal going in this direction. Okay, so just remember that the signal only goes in one direction. Okay. These are some common terminologies we use in neuroanatomy. Okay. I want to show you. So tract is a bundle of neuronal axons that are found in the central nervous system. Okay. So in the nervous system, you'll notice that neurons tend to travel together. So their cell bodies tend to be clustered together, and then their axons will form bundle on their way to another destination. Okay, so here's an example. And this picture specifically demonstrates a tract. So this one specifically is called corticospinal tract. You don't have to know what corticospinal tract is, but I'm trying to illustrate how the word tract is used. Notice that in this image, these round knobs is used to indicate the cell bodies of those neurons. And these lines are used to indicate the axons of those neurons. So the axons of these neurons are traveling together and they form a bundle. And this bundle of neuronal axons, okay, when it's found in the spinal cord or when it's found in the brain, it's called a tract. So this is a tract. Okay. But when such a bundle of neuron axons is found in the periphery, when it's found in the peripheral nervous system, we call that a nerve. So these are nerves that we know. Radial nerve, okay, median nerve, ulnar nerve, sciatic nerve. Sciatic nerve is similar. So make sure you understand that nerve and neurons are not the same thing. Okay, nerve is hundreds or thousands of neuronal axons bundled together. They're traveling together in the peripheral nervous system. Now the term nucleus or plural nuclei is used to refer to a cluster of neuronal cell bodies found in the central nervous system. So an example is basal nuclei. Okay. These basal nuclei, oftentimes known as basal ganglia, but I want to point out that this is actually a misnomer because technically this should be called basal nucleus or basal nuclei because they're located in the central nervous system. Okay. And so these are clusters of neuronal cell bodies. Okay. These are regions in which there is a cluster of cell bodies. And then ganglion, the term ganglion is used to refer to a similar thing, but when the cluster of neuron cell bodies is found in the peripheral nervous system instead. So here is an example of that. Okay. So here I have the dorsal root ganglion. What's illustrated is only a single neuron, but you have to imagine that there is thousands of these neurons, sensory neurons, with their cell body located inside dorsal root ganglion. Okay, and then they have two processes. Okay, this actually is considered a single axon, and we'll go over that in just a minute. Okay, so all right. Make sure you understand these definitions. Actually, make sure you have these down by memory. Okay, because this is going to be on an exam. These 4 terms. Okay. So a synapse is just a functional junction between neurons, and there are different types depending on whether the axon terminal synapsing onto the dendrite or it's synapsing onto the cell body, right? There are different types of junctions. These junctions can also be categorized by whether it's electrical type of synapse or a chemical type of synapse. And so watch this video, it will explain that very well to you. In this class, we're not really going to worry about electrical synapse. The one that we will study more depth is the chemical synapse. Okay. Make sure you go over the details here. I'll go over it quickly. But what happens in a chemical synapse is that the action potential or impulse travels down the axon and reaches the axon terminal. Here at the axon terminal, okay, there's a series of events which you will learn in physiology occurs, and that leads to the release of these neurotransmitters. So these neurotransmitters are contained inside vesicles. These vesicles, okay, fuse with the plasma membrane and dumps that neurotransmitter into this synaptic cleft. Okay, and these neurotransmitters then diffuse across the synaptic cleft and bind to this postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so this is known as the presynaptic neuron. This is known as a postsynaptic neuron, And that is because if this is the synapse, this is a junction, okay, then we're with respect to this junction, this is the neuron that's before the synapse, hence presynaptic. Okay, and this is a neuron after the synapse. Okay, and so this is known as postsynaptic neuron. Okay. Okay, here I want to explain that you can see neurons lined up in series, and whether a neuron is presynaptic or postsynaptic, okay, it all has to do with, it all depends on which specific synapse we're talking about. So say that there is an upstream neuron that's being synapsing onto this neuron. Okay. With regards to this specific synapse, that previous neuron will be considered presynaptic neuron, and this neuron will be considered postsynaptic neuron. However, if we're talking about this synapse, then this becomes the presynaptic neuron, and this becomes the postsynaptic neuron. And if we're talking about this next synapse, this becomes the presynaptic neuron, and that neuron that it is synapsing onto will become the postsynaptic neuron. Okay. Now, neurons can be classified either by structure or by function. Okay. The way that it is classified structurally, okay, is unipolar or pseudo-unipolar neuron, because true unipolar neurons don't exist in humans. But for the purpose of our class, we're just going to call them unipolar or pseudo-unipolar. Either is fine. Okay. And then we have bipolar and a multipolar. Okay. This diagram illustrates those three. Okay. Notice that whether it's unipolar or bipolar or multipolar, that classification depends on how many cell processes are extending from the cell body. So in multipolar neurons, there are multiple cell processes, okay, or dendrites extending directly from the cell body. In bipolar neurons, there are two cell processes extending from the cell body. In unipolar or pseudo-unipolar, there's a single process that extends from the cell body and then it splits into two. But this entire thing is considered an axon. Okay. So what happens in multipolar neurons, the dendrites are responsible for the receptive, carrying out the receptive signals. So it's relaying the information into the cell body, toward the cell body, and then this axon conducts that information away from the cell body. Okay. And this unipolar, however, can be kind of confusing because it's only got a single axon. So there's a peripheral process, okay, toward the periphery, and this central process is toward the central nervous system. Okay. And so this peripheral process of the axon is used for receptive purposes. So the signal comes in this way and then it's directed toward the central nervous system via the central process. And then for the bipolar, it's pretty easy. Just the signal is going to come through the dendrite toward the cell body and then down to the axon. Now, the thing I do want to point out is make sure you understand that multipolar neurons, first of all, make up about 99% of neurons in our nervous system. So the large majority of our neurons are multipolar neurons. Okay. Bipolar neurons are really rare. They're really only found in the retina of our eyes and some other special sensory organs, but they're relatively rare. Okay. And then the remaining is made up of unipolar neurons. Unipolar neurons, understand that unipolar neurons are almost always sensory neurons. Okay, so unipolar isn't synonymous with sensory, but most sensory neurons, okay, are going to be unipolar. Or most unipolar neurons are sensory neurons. Okay. Understand that multipolar neurons can be either interneurons or motor neurons. Okay, motor neurons are almost always multipolar neurons. Okay. Interneurons are also almost always multipolar neurons. Interneurons are neurons that are situated in between a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. So in this diagram, in this schematic, you see this will be a sensory neuron. It's relaying information toward the central nervous system. Motor neuron relays the information away from the central nervous system. And oftentimes you'll find an interneuron that helps with integration of that information, and the large majority of the neurons in our brain are interneurons. Okay, so they are highly responsible for higher order processing. Okay. A lot of the thoughts that are happening in your brain, okay, rely heavily on the interneurons. We're talking about the other secondary type of cell type we find in nervous tissue. So besides neurons, the other cells we find are generally neuroglia. Neuroglia are cells that support the functioning of neurons. So they do not conduct any impulse. They don't conduct any electrical signals. Okay. But they help to ensure that neurons are functioning properly. Now, I wanted to go over these different types of neuroglia on your own. But one thing I do want to point out that there is a certain type of cells that are responsible for myelinating or creating an insulation around the axon. Okay. And this type of the type of cell that is responsible for creating that myelin sheath, what we call myelin sheath, okay, those cells are called oligodendrocytes. So it's oligodendrocytes that myelinate the axons in central nervous system. So in our brain or our spinal cord, if we find myelin, those are created by the oligodendrocytes. When we find them in the peripheral nervous system, okay, that's a result of Schwann cells. So Schwann cells are the cells in the peripheral nervous system that are responsible for creating myelin sheath over axons. Okay. And here you can see the difference between oligodendrocytes in central nervous system and Schwann cells in peripheral nervous system. Oligodendrocytes, you can see that, well, this is already a simplified diagram. Okay, if I recall correctly, each of these oligodendrocytes can wrap up to 60 neurons at the same time. So they essentially have these extensions that wrap around the axons of different neurons and create that insulation. Okay, and as you'll learn in physiology, but an important point that I do want you to recognize that this insulation, this electrical insulation is very important. Okay, this helps enhance the conduction speed of that signal down the axon. So without that, okay, if you get rid of that myelin, then these axons would not be able to conduct as fast. Okay, and that's actually what happened in patients with multiple sclerosis or other autoimmune diseases that can cause deterioration of these myelin. Okay, so without the myelin or with reduced amount of myelin, the axon is not able to conduct electricity very well, and that signal can dissipate down the length of the axon. So once again, that's details, exciting details that you're going to learn when you get to physiology. But I want to contrast oligodendrocytes to the Schwann cells that you see in peripheral nervous system. Each Schwann cell can only wrap around a single axon, and multiple Schwann cells are used to wrap around a single axon. So these are separate Schwann cells. Each of these Schwann cells form a jelly roll-like structure around a segment of the axon. And these nodes, okay, these nodes or spaces in between the segments of myelin sheath, those are known as nodes of Ranvier. So node of Ranvier are the gaps formed between the myelin sheath. Now gray matter versus white matter. Oh, where is it? So gray matter appear gray, and they are the locations where you'll find generally cell bodies as well as non-myelinated axons. So mostly cell bodies. You see, this is where the cell bodies are located, and this is the cell body of the motor neuron. This is the cell body of that interneuron. Okay. In the spinal cord, the cell body of that sensory neuron is actually located in the dorsal root ganglion. And this is something we're going to talk about in the next few lectures.